Here's a woodcut map for Thomas More's famous book of a paradise that he called Utopia. Some have speculated that the Western Hemisphere may have inspired More when he wrote this book. Regardless of that, utopia is interesting for our purposes here because it literally means no place. There's the etymology of utopia coming from the Greek for not a place. Utopia simply does not exist anywhere on Earth, even though during the 1500s some Europeans began to dream of it, and they dreamed of it as existing somewhere outside of Europe. There's a map from 1630 reflecting the records and observations of European explorers. Beginning with Columbus, Western exploration began radically modifying the world both outside and within Europe. The effects of flora, fauna, and disease back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean is what we call the Columbian Exchange. In the Columbian Exchange, we see biological consequences for both hemispheres. For one thing, the partial list of food crops here revolutionized what was previously a grain-based European diet. But the Western Hemisphere also changed when Europeans introduced plants like these. And imagine the impact of all the livestock the Europeans introduced. Not to mention things like dandelions and all the grasses and other plants that many take for granted in the United States without knowing they came from Europe. There were a couple of diseases that Europeans caught in the Western Hemisphere and brought back to Europe. But much more consequential were the diseases Europeans brought to the Western Hemisphere. Many of these diseases had crossed over to humans from domestic animals, and especially from that list of livestock I just put on the screen. So millennia of exposure had given Europeans some degree of immunity, and by contrast the native people were practically 100% vulnerable. Smallpox in particular was almost always fatal among indigenous people. Think of the impact that honeybees had and continue to have on Western Hemisphere agricultural crop pollination. Today many are rightly concerned about colony collapse, but few seem to acknowledge that the European honeybees were introduced in the first place. Here are a couple of classic books by Alfred Crosby. Many decades ago, he pioneered the topic of the Columbian Exchange. Now let's focus especially on how the Columbian Exchange and subsequent forces drastically modified the United States. Here's the historic range of the American chestnut tree. Starting in the early 1900s, a blight derived from imported Chinese chestnut trees wiped out this forest. In some groves, American chestnut trees constituted as much as 90% of the forest species. Here's a historic example of this astonishing tree. It grew quickly, produced rot-resistant wood containing many natural oils, and was soft and easy to shape into fencing or housing. And on top of that, these trees produced megatons of chestnuts for wildlife and people to consume. This is what the Appalachian Mountains look like now in August. But imagine them as mostly white, because in August was when the chestnut tree bloomed. So the loss of the American chestnut changed the entire appearance of the Appalachian mountain range, not to mention the ecology. There is hope. After decades of research and experimentation with blight resistance, the American chestnut tree is now making a comeback. Now let's turn to the mid-continent. Only very small remnants remain of the prairie grasses and the bison they once sustained. Here's a diagram of root structures. This comes from Pacific Northwest prairies. These roots average over 4 feet deep, similar to the mid-continent grass of the prairies. These roots would actually break wooden plows, but the advent of the steel plow was the beginning of their end. However, the price for eradicating prairie grass came during the 1930s with the Dust Bowl. What a disaster. Farmers now use contour farming and retention of ground cover as ways to avoid another Dust Bowl, and some have undertaken limited prairie grass restoration. But what we now have is minuscule compared to the prairie grass that was there in, say, 1491. Speaking of remnants, here's a rare example of the oak savanna that once dominated Oregon's Willamette Valley. Less than 5% of this landscape now remains. Though we should note that native people helped create it in the first place through annual broadcasting of fire. Here's a map of historic savanna ranges now drastically altered, mainly through farming, especially evident in the great farming valleys along the west coast. Here's a 1973 postage stamp from a series celebrating rural life. Like the European honeybee, you will not find very many people objecting to introduced agricultural species, even though their presence represents the radically different environment that now accommodates them. Yet despite this, we commonly find a sort of Garden of Eden type of delusion. It's quite popular in environmental thinking. Here's a scene from a college campus. The sign in the foreground reads Habitat Improvement Area. This storm-damaged tree is being left to enhance the environment for wildlife. So what we really have is an environment highly altered by humanity surrounding a token of virtue signaling. Besides, even without rotting logs, campuses already support a great deal of typical urban wildlife, such as birds, rats, squirrels, mice, and the occasional possum or raccoon, even turkeys and deer. American wilderness areas are the core proxy for the Garden of Eden delusion. Here's an ironic Forest Service sign at the edge of a wilderness area. Apparently, the Forest Service does not mind if human waste gets buried in the wilderness, but not dog waste. Why does one violate the wilderness and the other does not? What about birds flying overhead and defecating seeds from invasive plant species? And why do they allow horses into the wilderness when they're not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere? What about global air quality? That affects the health of all forests worldwide, including wilderness forests. When we look around at the United States today, we see an environment that is unrecognizable compared to centuries past. The dream of utopia is as unrealistic as the idea that environmental paradise exists or can exist in the wilderness areas or anywhere else.